If you've been watching this channel for the past few years, you know that a frequent refrain of mine is that I don't have any access to any streaming services, so if I want to watch any movies, I'm just limited to what I can find uploaded onto YouTube. However, I have finally gotten access to a Netflix account, and I thought about all the things that I wanted to watch now that I have access to the Netflix account, and the thing that came up first in my mind was Masters of the Universe Revelation. This is a 2021 Netflix 10-episode show, which is a sequel of sorts to the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon from the 1980s, which I grew up with. Sort of. I'll get around to explaining all these qualifying remarks later in the video. Now, I know it's a little bit embarrassing at my age to admit that I wasted 5 hours, 10 episodes at about 23 minutes each, roughly 5 hours, watching He-Man cartoons, and yet, at the same time, I am squarely in the demographic that this show is aimed at, men who remember the Masters of the Universe cartoons from their childhood. So there you have it. Now, a few disclaimers before I get into this review. One disclaimer, I don't know if you can hear it already, but my voice isn't great. I'm battling a cold, I've got a cough, a sore throat, etc. Maybe if I was a wiser man, I wouldn't have filmed the video today, but my general policy is to review everything I read, watch, or listen to. And as a consequence of that, the policy is to just make the review as soon as I can. And don't wait till the perfect moment, because next week I'm going to have something else to review. So I'm going to try and push through this. By all means, if my scratchy voice becomes distracting, or if you find that this video is not watchable, feel free not to watch it. Maybe catch me on the next video. Hopefully I'm feeling better then. Second disclaimer, I was a little bit unsure how to structure or to break down these reviews. Because when this was originally released, it was released as Season 1, but with a Part 1 and a Part 2. And they, as I guess is common nowadays, they made a big deal about releasing it on a cliffhanger at the end of Part 1. You were supposed to wait till Part 2 to find out what happens. Everybody who was reviewing it at the time gave out their initial reviews at the end of Part 1. I mean, I know I'm 3 years late to the party, but everyone else on the internet was giving out their first reviews after Part 1 came out, and then gave out their second reviews after Part 2 came out. So it almost did seem like two different seasons. And there actually is another season to this, Masters of the Universe Revolution, which I've not seen yet, but which is only 5 episodes in its entirety. So the fact that Masters of the Universe Revolution is only 5 episodes makes me think that 5 episodes is how we're supposed to do this, how we're supposed to process this as units. So I decided I'm going to spend one whole video talking just about Part 1 and my thoughts on the franchise, and then the second video talking about Part 2. And the other advantage of doing that is that I can maybe spend some time in this first video talking about all my thoughts about He-Man franchise, and then the second video I'll just jump right into the actual Netflix Part 2. So all my reminiscing I'll try and get out of the way in this first video. Which brings me to my third disclaimer, or caveat. This video, I'm probably going to spend a lot of time reminiscing about childhood and talking about my memories of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Who knows? It could be a while before I actually get around to talking about the Netflix series. So you have been forewarned ahead of time. But yeah, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. So it strikes me, thinking about the target audience for this Netflix revival show, which admittedly I'm part of that target audience. But strikes me that to a certain extent there's a limited audience here, because anyone who was already an adult in the 1980s, when He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon came out, I'm sure has absolutely no interest in it. I mean, that cartoon show has no appeal to adult sensibilities. Unlike later animation series, which can appeal to both children and adults, this was... No adult with any functioning brain cells would be interested in this series. On the other hand, children who were born later, the generations who came after, I can't imagine they'd be interested in watching the old Filmation series either, because that series has not aged well. And if you go back and rewatch some of the episodes, and they're all available on YouTube, it's interesting how terrible it is. And, you know, it's one of those things, like a lot of childhood things. When I was a kid and I would watch it, I was utterly enraptured by it. Like, I was so absorbed in the story, the cartoon, I didn't want it to end. And because of those memories, you go back to it as an adult and you expect it to be good. And you watch it and you're like, this is terrible. How did I ever watch this? Well, I guess that's one of the things about becoming an adult. The animation that came after this, well, let me back up a moment. To be fair, I don't think He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was particularly bad for its time. I think if you look at animation that came out in the early 80s or in the 70s, it was just as bad, if not maybe even worse. But something changed by the time of the late 80s and early 90s. The animation, I don't know if there were any before this, but the animation that I can point to that was part of the new animation was DuckTales, which came out, I believe, 1988. The first part of the Disney cartoon, and then all the first part of the Disney Afternoon, and then all the other Disney Afternoon series that followed with it. Chippendales Rescue Rangers, Tailspin, Darkwing Duck, etc., where the animation style was just much better. And then, Batman, the animated series, Justice League Unlimited. I mean, the list just goes on and on about all the animation which followed, which could largely be watched by children and adults, and which still largely holds up today, which makes you wonder, what was it about the mid-1980s that was so terrible in terms of animation? Or maybe to put it another way, what happened in the late 1980s that made animation start to be good? I did do a little research on this. By little research, I mean a Google search. As a result of the Google search, I did find that people talk about the dark age of animation as being from the mid-1950s to the mid-1980s. Where animation was produced on a limited budget and had the very jerky motion that you can see in He-Man and the Masters of the Universe and the other animation before it. What I couldn't find, and admittedly I didn't spend a lot of time looking, but what I couldn't find is what exactly caused this. Well, I think I know what caused it, right? It was because animation was being made for television, whereas before that it had been made for theaters. But I guess the bigger question is, what happened in the late 1980s and early 90s to make animation good again? Was it technological developments? Was it a realization that money was to be made into it? Was it outsourcing the animation to South Korea, as many of these shows did? Made them more economical? I don't know. But point being, I don't think kids who grew up after He-Man came up, kids who were used to the animation from the late 80s or the 90s or afterwards, could have any interest in sitting through those old, crappy Filmation He-Man and the Masters of the Universe from the mid-1980s. The audience for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, I think, would be rather narrow. It would be boys, because it's mostly boys, isn't it? Who in the mid-80s were, say, between 5 years old and, I don't know, 10 years old, 12 years old. What would be the upper age limit for that in the mid-80s? I do remember I had one babysitter when I was a kid who was a teenager. He was, I don't know, maybe about 14, 15 at the time. And he would be able to talk about He-Man and the Masters of the Universe with us. He was our favorite babysitter. We thought he was the coolest, or I did. Because he knew all the characters, he knew the shows, and he was able to talk about it with us just like he was a second grader as well. I mean, he had a more sophisticated analysis, but he actually watched the show. So I guess maybe there were some preteens and teens watching this. But yeah, there was a limited window of people who could possibly be fans of this show. On the other hand, if you were in that window, you watched that show. Nowadays, I think media is a lot more diversified, right? Different people are watching different things because of all the stuff on YouTube and cable and Netflix and all the different streaming service. And there's just a million different things you could be watching, and not everyone is watching the same thing. But this was in the days before all that, so the media was a lot more monolithic. So every boy was watching He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, between the ages of 5 and 10 or whatever. So there's a narrow range of years that this nostalgia appeals to. But if you're in that range of years, you probably definitely watched it. Now, my own personal history with this is constantly arguing with my mother about being able to watch this, because my mother did not approve of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and she exercised a lot more control over my viewing habits than was typical of my classmates. So, and I've mentioned this on this channel a few different times before, how I grew up largely raised on Disney and PBS, because that was all I was allowed to watch. We were allowed to watch the Disney Channel or Disney home movies, and we could watch PBS, and that was it. Which is why I maybe have a lot more nostalgia for the Disney properties than maybe is typical for a male my age. But there you are. But yeah, I really wanted to watch He-Man, and I argued with my mother a lot about it, and I did get to watch it occasionally. So like when my dad was watching us, and he used to watch us once a week, he would let us watch He-Man. Sometimes the babysitters would let us watch it. We could watch it if we were at a friend's house, etc. So I did definitely get to see episodes of it, which is why I have that nostalgia for it. But I do not have the deep knowledge of that Filmation series that many people my age do, who watch that show 5 days a week, every day, and saw all the episodes and saw them when they were being rerun, and has seen every episode of it 5 times and has those episodes completely burned into their memory. I mean, I'm good on the major characters. I know Man-at-Arms and Teela and Orko and the Sorceress and He-Man and stuff like that. But as we start getting into the minor characters, I don't know that quite as well. And I mentioned that because that might come through in this review. If I ever get to the review, here we are 14 minutes in and I'm still babbling on about my background. But yeah, the reasons my mom objected to it, I didn't really understand at the time. But she was quite restrictive of our media in general. But the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was controversial at the time for a couple reasons. One, and it shared this with G.I. Joe and the other violent boys media that was coming into fashion at that time, is there was a period through the 1970s when militaristic boys entertainment was out of fashion because of the Vietnam War. And my mom was of the generation that had protested the Vietnam War, so she was not happy to see this stuff come back into fashion. I didn't understand any of that as a kid, but understand it better now. The other thing which I completely did not understand as a kid is that these shows were controversial because they were created because of Ronald Reagan deregulating the rules about advertising to children. So prior to this, you could not have a TV show which was essentially just an advertisement for a toy line. After Ronald Reagan's deregulation, then the TV shows could be advertisements for toy lines, and they did. Just about every major TV show in the 1980s was an advertisement for a toy line, in the mid-1980s at least. Which was why there were so many characters associated with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, because the more characters you would have in the cartoon, the more toys you would be able to sell. Now, call me a little bit naive or a little bit slow on the uptake, but I completely did not understand this as a kid. I thought that there were so many characters in the storyline because that's the story that the writers of the show wanted to tell. And I thought the fact that there were toys attached to them was just an outgrowth of that. So I assumed that the show was driving the creation of the characters, and then creating the toy line, whereas in reality it was completely the opposite way. They would come up with the toy first, and then they would come up with a way to shoehorn it into the TV series. But like I said, I didn't understand this as a kid, so I was fascinated, as I think a lot of people of my generation were, by the world building of this series. So I was fascinated by how many characters they had and how many different lands there were associated with these different characters, because a lot of them came from little different kingdoms or little different lands within Eternia. I was fascinated by just all the different characters that were associated with the TV show. And I remember even after the TV show stopped being on the air, the toy line kept going for a few years after that, is my recollection. Or at least after I stopped being interested in the TV show. Maybe it was still on the air in reruns, but the toy line kept going. So, we would go to the toy store with my dad around Christmas time to look at all the new toys, and you'd see all these new Masters of the Universe toys, and I would think, and they would, near the end, they would get more and more bizarre. Like there were these toys about Masters of the Universe figures which could transform into rocks, and then there were these animals that could transform into rocks, which were allies of both the good guys and the bad guys. And I remember thinking to myself, I haven't been watching the show for a while, but it looks like it's doing interesting things now. The story is really getting out there and exploring new characters. And I had no idea that they were never in the TV show at all. They were just, it was just purely the toy line at this point. But that, I think for me and a lot of people of my generation, the fascination with this rich world that was overly populated with all these different characters fascinated us then and stuck with us even as we got older. certainly, I remember when the internet became a thing and you could look up everything online. I spent some time looking up all the different characters of the Masters of the Universe, and that's when I found out, for example, that some of these rock creatures were never actually in the show, or that the whole thing about how the show was essentially just a toy commercial because of Reagan's deregulation. I've also discovered in my years living abroad that the show has some cross-cultural appeal. People who grew up in England, who are the same age as me, also have the same nostalgia for it. Although it may just be limited to English-speaking countries. I don't know. Like certainly when I lived in Japan, the Japanese people it had not been popular in Japan at all. I don't know about what it would be like in South America or France or whatever. And again, as always, let me know what your experiences are in the comments. What country are you from? How old are you? What was your experience with Masters of the Universe? But yeah, when the internet became a thing, it was possible to go back and rewatch these old episodes. For many years after they had disappeared from TV, you just couldn't watch them. And people maybe who grew up before YouTube might not appreciate this. With YouTube, you can always just kind of look up and watch something on YouTube. Even if not the whole show, you can watch clips of it. But before YouTube, it was hard to track down stuff once it stopped airing on TV. But once I was able to track it down on YouTube again and rewatch some of those He-Man and the Masters of the Universe series, then I realized just how unwatchable they were. From a variety of reasons. The Filmation, the old Filmation was very jerky because it was produced on a limited budget. The plots were very patronizingly simple. Animation got a lot more sophisticated in the years following. The jokes were very forced. The whole thing was just purely aimed at young boys. It was not trying to cultivate any broader audience at all at the time. And then once you age out of that age group, then you can't really watch it anymore. I guess that's the thing with growing old. But it did make, excuse me, there's that cough coming back. Got some hot beverage here. The idea of all these seemingly infinite amount of characters associated with the franchise still tickled my imagination. You began to imagine how much fun it would be to just take these characters, all these rich characters, and put them in something more interesting, like a better show. And to a certain extent, that's what happened with the 2002 reboot of this show. Now, I was not aware of the 2002 reboot when it actually came out. I was living in Japan at the time. It was, before YouTube, so the internet was still in its infancy. I just was completely oblivious to the fact that it existed when it came out. But I discovered it when I was older. I discovered it after the internet became more sophisticated, maybe around 2009, I want to say. There were episodes of it on YouTube. I read about it on Wikipedia. And I did watch several episodes of it. And thought that 2002 reboot was a much better use of those characters. Unfortunately, I didn't encompass the She-Ra characters because that's, where half of those characters come from. But we'll talk about maybe She-Ra another day, or not. We'll see. But it was well, like I said, animation from the mid '80s was just completely unsophisticated at all. Animation after the mid '80s was watchable by more age groups, and this, even as an adult, was more watchable. I was able to watch several episodes of it without losing my attention. Now, eventually you do get a little bit sick of it. And the storyline was more interesting, but it was still locked into kind of good guys fighting bad guys. Which, you know, is what all these characters are designed to do. But I wonder if there's even a more interesting story to be told with these characters. Some sort of like, you know, Game of Thrones type thing where you have, okay, the bad guys will always be the bad guys, but maybe among the good guys, some of them have ulterior motives. Maybe some of them are scheming to become king themselves or set themselves up on their own power base. And they're all kind of against the evil horde, but they're all kind of looking out for themselves as well. Maybe that could be the next reboot of these characters. But, yeah. Point being, I guess, I am interested to see what happens with these characters. And so I guess I'm right in the target audience for the Netflix revival of this series. Okay. It's the problem with doing these things unscripted. Sometimes you don't quite know how long it's going to take you to say something until you say it. I've talked now for about 26 minutes just on my history with this show. So it's a little bit late to get into my review of the Netflix reimagining of these characters. So we're just going to change the title of this video. This video is not going to be Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 1 review. That will be the next video. This video will be reminiscing about the Masters of the Universe franchise.